Welcome. I'm happy to have another opportunity to study with you in this overview of the Bible. We've looked at the patriarchal age, now the Mosaic age, and we're reaching the end of that period of Bible history. In this lesson, we want to look at that period of time following the captivity in Babylon until the end of the Old Testament books. That is the period of the return and restoration of the Jews in the land of Palestine. This material covers the book of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Also, you can read about this period of time in the prophet Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Following this period, there's 400 years of silence, and then the New Testament begins. So let's look at this period of Bible history. The first person really that has to be talked about is Cyrus the Great. The rise of Cyrus the Persian. He became king over the Medo-Persian Empire in 559. He expanded that kingdom from the Indus River in the east all the way to the Aegean Sea in the west. And then in 539, he took that kingdom and invaded Babylon and defeated the Babylonian, the Chaldean kingdom, and he took possession of the city of Babylon. And of course, all of those captive people that were there under the Babylonian captivity, Cyrus had a different kind of policy towards captive nations. We're told in history that he was viewed as, of course, a great and good master leader, and he was very friendly and frank and extremely considerate of those over which he ruled. That he decided that all of these captive peoples that were serving as slaves there or deported out of their homeland would be able to go back and to rebuild their temples and their lives and worship their gods freely. And it was more of a attitude of ruling with good administration and kindness in comparison to brute force that the Assyrians and Babylonians had used. So he allowed the people to go home, and just as God had foretold, he offered a decree for the Jews to go home and was even going to support them in the rebuilding of their temple. In the book of Ezra, in Ezra 1, verses 2 through 4, thus says Cyrus the king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. Every survivor, at whatever place he may live, let the men of that place support him with silver and gold, and with goods and cattle, together with a freewill offering for the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. So Cyrus made this great decree. He was a specially raised up instrument of God. He was foretold, his coming and his birth and his success was foretold 150 years before by Isaiah the prophet. And one of the great demonstrations of how the God who inspired our Bible is able to see the future and to do what no other religion can do. This God can foretell and see the future. In Isaiah 45:1, thus says the Lord to Cyrus, his anointed, whom I have taken by the right hand to subdue nations before him, and to loose the loins of kings, to open the doors before him, so that gates will not be shut. All of his success came about through the providence of God and his help. In Isaiah 45:4, for the sake of Jacob my servant and Israel my chosen one, I have also called you by my name, or by your name, and I have given you a title of honor, though you have not known me. So God is behind the scenes. Cyrus didn't realize that Jehovah God was the one that was giving him success and raising him up to be his instrument, so that he, at the end of 70 years of captivity, would be able to allow the Jews to go home from captivity. Well, the first company that left the city of Babylon and the territory of Babylon and went back to rebuild the temple with the help of the Persian government was Zerubbabel, who was a son of David. He was from David's household. Joshua, the high priest. Bazar was in charge of all of the furniture and the different vessels that were taken from the temple in Jerusalem at the time of the captivity and stored in the treasury in Babylon. He was in charge of that, those precious things, bringing them back to Jerusalem. And so that's all discussed in the book of Ezra, in Ezra chapter 2. In that place, we're told that 42,360 Jews were in that caravan that went back to the land of Judah. They had 7,337 slaves. 4,000 of the priestly family were in that number. 7,500 animals that helped them to transport their goods was going along with them, along with horses and donkeys and camels. And what a great day it must have been when they marched out of Babylonian captivity and were headed back to the promised land. They went with a religious purpose to reestablish the nation of Israel and the temple as a place of worship in Jerusalem. There were few left in the land of Palestine that were Jews at the time that they returned. During that time of the Babylonian captivity, the few that were left behind, many of them had intermarried with the Edomites and Moabites and Ammonites, the peoples of the land round about them. And these different nations had pushed in, crowded into the territory that had once belonged to Judah. So it was a very difficult circumstance that these returning pilgrims were heading into. The Samaritans in the north had expanded down closer to Judean territory, and Jerusalem was just a heap of ruins and debris at the time that Zerubbabel and Joshua and these men arrived in the city. So they began in 536 to lay the foundation and rebuild the foundation of the temple in Jerusalem. At that time, it was 70 years since the temple of Jerusalem was destroyed. Isn't that interesting? 70 years. The people had gone into captivity first in 606, and now they're returning, back to the land in 636. So the people, it's 70 years they're come back. The temple was destroyed in 586, and we're going to see that they lay the foundation of the temple in 516, so it's also 70 years. So remarkable how God's word is fulfilled in both degrees. Ezra 3 and verse 7, then they gave money to the masons and carpenters, and food and drink and oil to the Sidonians and to the Tyrians, to bring cedar wood from Lebanon to the sea at Joppa, according to the permission they had from Cyrus, king of Persia. So they secure all of these stone workers and woodworkers and different skilled laborers to help rebuild the temple. And the Phoenicians cut and transport cedar wood to Joppa in order for them to begin the rebuilding process. We're told that in the second year after they returned, they laid the foundation with a great ceremony and much rejoicing that they had completed the altar and completed the foundation of the temple. And all of the younger people rejoiced greatly, and there was much celebration and joy when they laid the foundation of the temple. There were some old men that could remember the glories of Solomon's temple, and they wept on that day. But the sound of the rejoicing was greater than the sound of the weeping. The general plan and size of the temple, the sanctuary of the temple, was the same as Solomon's, but it did not have all of the costly decorations and the gold and all of the precious things that were in Solomon's temple. It didn't have all the ornate furniture and refinements that you found with Solomon's temple. So as far as earthly glory is concerned, it fell far short of what Solomon's temple was. Well, opposition stops the building of the temple in those days. There were all of these mixed-raced people and Gentiles that surrounded Jerusalem, and those of mixed race wanted to come and help rebuild the temple in Ezra 4:3. But Zerubbabel and Joshua and the rest of the heads of the fathers' households of Israel said to them, "You have nothing in common with us in building a house to our God, but we ourselves will together build to the Lord God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us." So they say, you don't have any part in this. You're still, they were half worship, they worshiped Jehovah, but they also worshiped idols. And they said, you don't have anything to do with the rebuilding. This is our job and our mission. And so there was a great feud started between the Samaritans and these others and the Jewish people that continued on down into the New Testament days and even to today. There's opposition between Jews and Samaritans. The Samaritans and these others went and hired counselors and threw up every kind of roadblock to try to stop the building of the temple. And they sent false reports and letters to the king of Persia saying that they were rebellious people and they were planning to rebel against the king. And so Artaxerxes, the Persian king, stopped the building of the temple for a period of time. So they have a great setback that takes place after the foundation is laid. Then Haggai and Zechariah the prophets are raised up by God to encourage the people in 520 BC. Haggai came to Zerubbabel and Joshua to rebuke the people for ceasing their work and just forgetting about the work of the temple. Their work on the temple needed to be done. They had set that aside and began to put paneling in their houses and beautify their own houses, but they hadn't looked to the building of the temple. And so God had sent a drought upon the people, and all of their efforts to try to get ahead were being thwarted because they were under a curse from God because they haven't come back to building the temple. So they listened to the prophet, and they're encouraged then to start this project anew. Listen to Haggai 2:9. He says about this temple that they're building, "The latter glory of this house will be greater than the former, says the Lord of hosts. And in this place I will give peace, declares the Lord of hosts." So this temple they're building, the temple of God, is going to be greater in the end than it is now. They're going to build a very simple temple. Herod later rebuilds it as a magnificent temple. Jesus Christ comes to that temple. He is the true dwelling place of God and brings great glory to that temple by teaching there. And then Jesus from that place, through the giving of the Holy Spirit to the apostles, begins the New Testament church, which is the temple, the house of the living God. So the latter glory is going to be greater in the end. Zacharias also, in his book, preached and gave strong encouragement to the people to build. He points out how God's Spirit is going throughout the earth to support them, and the enemies are going to be broken, and their efforts to stop this work are going to be thwarted. In Ezra 6:14, "And the elders of the Jews were successful in building through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah, the son of Iddu, and they finished building according to the commandment of the God of Israel and the decree of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, kings of Persia." So after 4 years, the building was completed in 516 BC. With great rejoicing, they celebrated a great Passover, a great feast of unleavened bread, and of course, having the temple as the central place of their worship and having that completed was a very stabilizing thing for the Jewish nation and the Jewish people to rally around. And now they could build their future and their hope now that this temple was completed. Next, we turn to the period of Esther. The book of Ezra is divided it really in two parts. There's the building of the coming back to the land and the story about rebuilding the temple in chapters 1 through 6 of Ezra. Then the last half of Ezra deals with the reestablishing of the law and the different reforms that were brought about in the land. And that there's a gap between those two sections. In between that period of time, you have the events that are found in the book of Esther. This is during the reign of Ahasuerus, as he's called in the Bible. Xerxes, as you think about him as the ruler of the Greeks, or the ruler of Persia. And so Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, reigned from 483 to 464 BC. He reigned over Persia in Susa, or Susan was the capital that you can see in the middle of the map at that time. A few years after his reign, the city of Susa was destroyed, and the great palace there that's described was destroyed, and really all of the customs and things about that period of time kind of passed away, and Persepolis and other places were the main city. The things recorded in the book of Esther apply to that period of time in history. It shows this book is ancient. It goes back to these real events, and it describes that palace and all that archaeologists have now found in an accurate way. So it's a trustworthy history that's given. We have Darius, the head of Persia, had gone and attacked the Greeks. And at the Battle of Marathon, they defeated Darius. And so the Greeks were saved from the Persians. But of course, this certainly stirred up a lot of animosity between the two sides. And then when Xerxes came to power, he prepared to punish the Greeks. He put together a gigantic army and built a bridge across the Hellespont so that he could cross over and attack Greece from Asia, and brought that great army into the land and defeated the Greeks in the north. The people of Sparta had just a limited number of soldiers that they could send to defend the pass at Thermopylae. The 300 put up a valiant, heroic battle, but eventually were overcome. The city of Athens was evacuated, and then there was a great sea battle that was fought at Salamis. And it was one of the turning points in history. The Greeks won a complete victory there. Then later, at Plataea, the Greek land army was able to defeat the army of Xerxes and drive them out of the land of Greece, and almost annihilated that army that was left behind. The king had fled back to the land of Persia after the defeat at Salamis. He was sitting up on a mountainside watching that battle that took place there in the sea. Well, Xerxes then returned, and they were told by the Greek historians that he was trying to comfort himself with his harem, and he later gave over himself to dissipation and was finally assassinated in 464. Well, let's look then at the things that happened in the book of Esther. There was a great drinking party that was held by Xerxes, certainly fits with this picture of dissipation, that the rule was everyone was to drink all they wanted and all they could. And after this had gone on for a number of days, the king sent and asked for the queen Vashti, who was known for her great beauty, to be brought in to this drunken party so that he might display his wife's beauty to all of his drunken guests. And she refused to come. And as a result of this dishonor to the king, as he saw it, and all of his counselors' advice, he took the queenship away from Vashti. And they said that he should have a great, really, beauty contest and bring in from all of the provinces of Persia the most beautiful young virgins, that they might be prepared for 12 months and then be brought in one after another to the king, and that he should choose one of these women to become the queen. And at this time there was a man that served in the court named Mordecai the Jew. and he had raised, when Esther was young, her parents had died, and he raised her. It was his uncle's daughter, and he had become like a father to her and adopted her, raised her, and he advised her that she should join this contest to become queen. And she followed the instruction of Hegai, the main eunuch and one that was in charge of the women that were in this contest, followed all his advice about what to do. And when her time came to go in before the queen, she followed his advice. And she so impressed the king that he chose her to be queen. She was raised up to be queen of Persia. Then we're told that while Mordecai was, of course, outside the palace and paying close attention to all of these things that were happening with Esther, that he overheard a plot by a couple of the servants that were disgruntled against Xerxes, and he sent word to Esther, who sent word to the king, and as a result of this, the king's life was saved. The plot was found out. The men were hung, and things were recorded in the chronicles of the king of Persia about what Mordecai had done. So this brings us then to the enemy of the story in the book of Esther, and that is Haman. Haman is exalted. He's a very rich and powerful man. He has great influence with Xerxes, and Mordecai, as a Jew, will not bow down and worship before Haman, even though all of the other servants do so. And this greatly insults Haman, that Mordecai will not pay this homage to him. And as a result, he finds out that Mordecai is a Jew, and about the Jewish religion and their refusal to worship anyone other than God. And so Haman comes up with an idea to destroy not only Mordecai, but all of the Jews throughout the Persian Empire. He casts lots and fixes a certain month and day that this attack against the Jews will come. He goes before the king and tells him that he has this rebellious group of people that don't follow the ways of the Persians, and that they needed to be eliminated, and that he would pay 10,000 talents of silver into the treasury of the king. And so he kind of puts a bribe in along with his request, and he's given permission to write an order that the Jews would be destroyed. And this command was given and sent out throughout the different provinces of the Persian Empire. So God's people are under a great threat. How's Christ ever going to come into the world through the Jewish people if this decree is allowed to go forward? There's great mourning and outcry throughout the Persian Empire, and in the city of Susa, Mordecai puts on sackcloth and sits outside the gate. Esther, of course, is also affected very deeply when she hears about this decree. She tries to send clothes out to Mordecai, but he refuses to wear them, and sends a note in that is read to the queen that she's got to go in and plead on behalf of her people in order to save them. She said, well, she has not seen the king in 30 days. He hasn't called for her in 30 days. And if anyone goes in to see the king without him summoning them, unless he puts out his scepter, when you come in, you'll be put to death. And then Mordecai told her in Esther 4 and verse 14, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained to royalty for such a time as this. Says, can't you see that you've got to do this? That you may, by God's providence, have been put in this position to do this very thing. God's people are going to be delivered some way or another. But woe unto you if you don't step up and do what you can do with your position. And she sent out an order for the Jews to fast for 3 days. and pray. And she would do so also with her servants. And then she would go in before the king and make the request. So we see prayer and fasting and God's providence answering this prayer. Esther goes before the king without being summoned. And the king is very happy to see her and extends his scepter to her and says that he would give her anything she requested, up to half the kingdom. And she said that she wanted to have a meal with the king and Haman. And so they went to a meal with her. And he asked her, what is the request that you have? And to draw this out and make this even, more of a important request, she says that she will tell him the next day if he and Haman will come to dinner again with her on the next day. Well, Haman is very pleased with himself that he's been specially selected by the queen to eat with the king and then to be requested to come back the next day. But as he's leaving this meal, all of the servants bow to him, but he sees Mordecai refusing to do so. And he is angry. Goes home and talks to his family about all of his sons that he has and the wealth that he has and the power that he has and all of the good things that have happened to him in his life. But all of it is ruined because Mordecai will not bow down to him. And his friends said, why doesn't he just go to the king to get a command to have Haman or have Mordecai hung? And so Haman thinks this is a great idea. He's going to go in first thing in the morning and make that request. He has a gallows 50 cubits high, or 50 cubits high, built, and goes in to see the king. And as he, before he's able to make his request, we find out that King Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, has had a restless night in which he could not sleep. And he called for the chronicles to be brought in and read to him. And they read the passage to him about Mordecai, telling about the plot and saving the king's life. And he asked his servants, what's been done for Mordecai to honor him after he did this good deed to the king? And they said there hadn't been anything done. And as he's thinking over how he might honor Mordecai, he asked if there is anyone waiting outside. And they said that Haman was there. He said to have Haman brought in. And he asked Haman, what should the king do for the man that he desires to honor? And Haman said, well, who thought to himself, who would the king want to honor more than me? And he said that he should get a man of nobility to take him, put the king's robe on him, and place him upon a horse that only the king rides, that has a crown on its head, and this nobleman should lead the man the king wants to honor through the streets, and saying, this is how you're honored when the king wants to honor you. And then he said, go and do that to Mordecai. And so Haman, then we can see his fall coming. He ends up spending the day taking Mordecai on this horse through the city of Susa and calling out for the people to see how one is honored by the king. After the day ended, he covered his head in shame and went back to his family and friends. And they told him this was surely a sign that since he was a Jew, that Haman was going to fall. Servants came at that time and called Haman to the dinner with the queen. And he went in, and the king made the request, what is it that you want, Esther? And she said that she wanted to be saved from her people being destroyed, killed, and that herself being destroyed. Said if it was just that they were going to be made slaves, it wouldn't be worth the king's annoyance for her to bring it up. But since they're all going to be killed, he said, who is this one that would do this to the queen and her people? And she said, this enemy and foe is Haman, and pointed him out right there at the dinner. And of course, the king, with great anger, arose from the dinner and went out into the garden. And Haman came and bowed himself down on the bed, or the couch, that Queen Esther was eating at, pleading for his life. And when the king came back in, he said, "Will this man even try to force the queen and attack the queen in my own house?" And his servant said that he had built a gallows for Mordecai, and he ordered them to take Haman that very moment and take him to the gallows and hang him there. And you can see the providence of God, how God rules among the kingdoms of men, that a sleepless night, a reading of the proper passage, all of these circumstances work together to deliver the Jewish people from annihilation. And after this, Mordecai was exalted to the place that Haman had had. The king's signet ring was given to Mordecai, that he might be a part of passing these laws and rules. Esther and Mordecai asked the king that they might reverse this order that Haman had made to destroy the Jews. And the rule was that once the law was signed by the king of Persia, you couldn't change it. So they needed to write some other order, some other command that might offset that command. And so they ordered and sent it throughout the land that the Jews could arm themselves, gather in the cities where they live, and defend themselves against their enemies. And as a result, there was a great deliverance that took place. And the Jews won a great victory over their enemies. And yet they didn't seize any of the spoil from those people that were their enemies that they killed. And there was a feast to remember that day when the lot of Haman was cast, that day on which they got this great deliverance, the Feast of Purim. So the book of Esther tells us about this great deliverance, about the background to that particular feast among the Jews. And it's recorded for us how they remembered that day. Then we come back to the second part of the book of Ezra. There is a decree by Artaxerxes that Ezra can take a group of people back with more treasure, and that they might continue to rebuild Jerusalem and reestablish the law of Moses. It's a great decree that he's able to organize the people and teach the law of Moses and have the worship of God, set in order according to the law of Moses. And they are going to set out on this great trip back to the promised land, and they pray for protection and guidance. They were ashamed to ask for a bodyguard from the Persian army, because they said God could protect them. And so they prayed to God to do so, and over a period of 4 months they traveled back to the land of Palestine. The book of Ezra tells about their number and names of all of those that came back. There was great religious reform that took place under Ezra the priest and scribe. The people had violated the law that were in the land by intermarrying with the people of the land, and they were idolaters. They were falling back into the same trap that had destroyed Solomon and many of the people in the past. And so there was great humiliation in the heart of Ezra. He put on sackcloth. He mourned and wept before all the people. And there was a great reform that took place. The people prayed to God. The people asked for forgiveness. The foreign wives were put away, and they were taught the law of Moses. He taught his people the law. He made sure that they understood what the law of Moses was all about. He arranged and copied all the books of the Old Testament and put them together and made copies of them so that all the people could teach the law and understand what their duties were under the covenant. He established regular teaching of the law. The idea of the synagogue was strengthened, where they had in each of these local communities of the Jews meetings on the Sabbath day for the law to be read and the prophets to be read and the people to be taught. So this really helped build up the Jewish religion and reform it and restore it. Meanwhile, in 444 BC, you have the beginning of the work of Nehemiah. Nehemiah was a cupbearer, some high official and intimate acquaintance with the king of Persia at that time, Artaxerxes. And he heard from his brother that had come back to the Persian capital about the terrible state that the Jews were in, how the city walls were still just rubble, and they had no protection against their enemies, and people were in a very unsafe and low condition. And of course, this filled Nehemiah, who was a very religious man and devoted to God, with great grief and sorrow. He prayed to God that he might be allowed to go back and to be able to help the people, and his prayer was answered. Nehemiah secured permission to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. He went in as cupbearer to the king, and he had a sad expression on his face, and he was asked what it was that was making him sad, and he prayed to God and answered the king, and told him about the state of his people and wanting to go back and help them, and he got the permission to do so. So he was sent back with a number of servants and with resources to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. He came as governor and first went around the city secretly and surveyed the wall, all of the places where the wall was to be built, and saw the sorry state of things. And then he told the people about how God had answered his prayer and what the mission was. In chapter 2 of Nehemiah, in verse 18, I told them how the hand of God had been favorable to me, and also how the king's word, which he had spoken to me. And they said, let us arise and build. And so they put their hands to the good work. He organized the people, and each family had different sections of the wall that they all worked on simultaneously, and the wall then began to be built. There was a lot of opposition that was brought against his efforts to try to rebuild this wall. We're told that Sanballat and Tobiah, who was an Ammonite, and Geshem, all of these different enemies of God, these leaders, tried to stop the work of the rebuilding of the wall. They used ridicule, saying to the people while they were building that it was so shoddy that even if a fox jumped on it, it would fall down. And what did they think they were going to do? They threatened them with violence. They raided the people, but the Jews heard about these raids coming and were able to organize defenses and station guards in order to protect themselves, along with prayer. So they pray to God, and then they take the actions that are in their power to act, and as a result, they're able to fend off these attacks. The people are reminded that God is great and awesome, is what Nehemiah does. He encourages the people by reminding them of the faithfulness and power of God. They labor and work, with half of the people holding weapons of war and the others working in building the wall. And they also had swords ready at hand to fight against their enemies. This work went on for 52 days until they completed the whole circuit of the wall with its 12 gates. They had done a great work. Following this, then Nehemiah carried out a number of offenses in the land. He corrected and helped the poor people that had to sell themselves to their brethren that were rich, and got them to be set free from their debts. He himself showed an example of the type of dedication that the people needed to have, in that he didn't take any taxes from the people to feed his servants and himself, but he fed 150 Jews and officials from his own wealth. He was a man that was able to stand up against all of the deceptions used by the enemies. They attempted to have meetings with him where they could assassinate him, but he refused to be lured in by these different false promises of compromise. Then they used different malicious slander to try to say the Jews were rebellious. They even gave out a false prophecy that he would be killed and that he should flee to the temple for protection. But he refused to show himself a coward and fall into this false prophecy. Well, the work was finished and the enemies were discouraged when they saw what Nehemiah's work in the rebuilding of the city walls had accomplished. They recognized in the end that God had been with the workers as they built those walls. So the city was organized and the population increased. Nehemiah cooperated with Ezra in the reforms. He gave encouragement to the public instruction in the law. The feasts were observed. Confessions of transgressions were made and confessions of faith. The days of fasting were made, and they appealed to God for his grace in the days of Nehemiah. They made a new covenant with God. The residents of Jerusalem, 1/10 of the people in the other villages came either by lot or voluntarily to repopulate the almost abandoned city of Jerusalem so that the city of Jerusalem could be built up. He registered the priests and the Levites, and they were put into their different divisions and so on that they could serve. He had to return to Persia in 431 BC, but then he shortly was able to come back after reporting to the king. And he found again trouble had happened while he was gone. He had to separate the congregation from Ammonites and Moabites. Tobiah, through influence with the priest at the temple, was able to set up a room at the temple to live in, and all of that stuff was moved out of the temple, and that separation was encouraged to remove this Gentile influence. The Jewish people were to stay separate from the other nations so that Christ might come through them, that they might stay loyal to the law until Christ came. And so Nehemiah worked to remove all of this defilement from the temple, to bring about reforms, to get people tithing, to get the treasury going again. He did away with violations of the Sabbath, drove people away from the wall that would wait right outside the wall for the Sabbath to be over. He again helped encourage people to put an end to mixed marriages, and he removed corrupt priests from the priesthood, and he prayed for God's mercy. So Nehemiah helped set the nation on the right course, along with the work of Haggai, the prophet, and Zechariah and Malachi. Well, then there's that period of 400 years of silence. In the next lesson, I'd like to go back and look at the messianic prophecies that were taking place during this period of time before the end of the Old Testament, as it looks forward to the life of Christ. And that's the next thing that we'll study, those messianic prophecies. God bless you, be with you. Read these books. They'll encourage you in your faith.